Hello and welcome to our panel, this second day of MAGFest. It's really good to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I am joined today by two of my longtime colleagues. I guess you're not a longtime colleague. You're a longtime colleague. And so we're just going to start with introducing ourselves. I'm Brooke Ferd. My primary instrument is oboe English horn. I started in the VGM scene as a cover artist back in 2016. And then now I'm more of a session musician for video game soundtracks, and that's how I had met Gregory. And so, and I also, in my local area, so I'm based in California, I do a lot of session work in the Los Angeles region, and then I also play in local symphonies in the Central California region, and I teach college oboe. So that is a little bit about me. I will pass it off to Gregory.
Right. Hi, my name's Greg. I am also a session musician who has recorded woodwinds for video game soundtracks. Most notably, I've done a woodwind work on Chained Echoes, and I studied at CCBC for flute performance, and I studied at Towson University for clarinet. And yeah, and here to talk about some woodwinds today. So,
all right. Hi, I'm the soon-to-be longtime colleague. I am an arranger and an event organizer in the general VGM scene. Worked with Greg extensively in the past, and look forward, Brooke, to working with you in the future as well. My claim to fame is mostly with the University of Maryland Gamer Symphony Orchestra, where worked on concerts such as at the Kennedy Center, Smithsonian, things like that, and mostly doing arrangements and small and large.
Very cool.
That's me.
All right.
Hey, Alex. Awesome. So this will be a very similar format if you had attended our panel in VGM Con, but we do have an extra 30 minutes. Our last panel was an hour long. This one we have 90 minutes.
So we're going really in depth.
We're going very in depth, and we've added some additional information and kind of more like general considerations for the instrument, arranging for small and large woodwind ensembles. So we kind of added some additional stuff there. So we do realize that we have a very diverse crowd of people. Some of you probably studied music. Some of you have an extensive knowledge of music theory, and then some of you maybe have no classical training. Regardless of your level of music, this hopefully will be useful to you. We're going to be playing a lot of recordings of instruments, so you'll be able to hear what the different ranges sound like. Maybe you're inspired to use it for your compositions or your arrangements. So hopefully this will be useful to everyone depending on where you're at musically. And then a super exciting announcement. Everyone gets really excited when I tell them. We have created a summary handout of this entire presentation, or we call this a cheat sheet. We have electronic, and we have physical hard copies here. We printed out 50, which I believe covers everyone, but we also have electronic QR code at the end. So if we run out, you can scan that as well and have a digital copy. And so we thought this was very, very important to do, especially because there's going to be so much information being thrown at you. And if you're a note taker, it's really hard to scribble down everything, because it's just a lot of technical information about ranges and limitations. And rather than just worrying about, because you're probably next week, you'll probably forget most of the stuff you listened to at this presentation. So we created like a summary of everything we've done here. So when the panel is over, you can scan a digital copy and you can come and pick one up. Please come and pick them up. It is your cheat sheet. You can laminate it, leave it on your desk, and it will be a nice reference sheet for you moving forward.
Now, how many of you in here are arrangers and composers and stuff like that? All right. Now, how many of you in here are intimidated when trying to write for woodwinds? Okay. All right. Yep.
So we might as well go around the room a little bit and see, like, any of you want to share what you're trying to get out of this, and what you're interested in.
Just for clarification on the range works. I myself am a low brass guy. No good at that stuff. Especially flutes. Way low and way high.
Yep.
Sometimes we're supposed to use high, and sometimes we're supposed to use low. Like I arrange. I'm the music director for the New York City Police Department band. And
wow.
Right.
It's a lot of fun. Yes, real thing comes. I ask them constantly to let me know, like, hey, is this good? Yeah. And then I hear them kind of change things. I'm like, please tell me. I don't know how to fix this. So that's what we get to this, exactly how to use those instruments properly. And especially in a setting where I'm not dealing with pros, I'm dealing with 7th grade level 2 pro musicians.
And we're going to break that down.
All of that down, depending on what you're writing for.
Yep.
Very cool. So yeah, we do believe, so like a little bit about why we think this panel is important. We think that the fundamentals of the instrument, general considerations are very important and necessary to write great parts. A common misconception is people think I can give my woodwind players anything and they can play whatever I want as long as they're good enough. And that's not really true. There are limitations or natural limitations of every instrument. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those.
And there are things that will not sound nearly as good as your MIDI. With
Yeah,
live
yeah.
instruments.
Just at that
So,
point, just use VSTs
Yeah.
if you want to
Right.
achieve that. Yeah.
I was about to say that. I was,
Yep.
I'm working on a large project and an opera-based song, which was Mask, and he met me.
Mhm.
And then I asked him if he wanted to help me proofread some parts
Mhm.
we were writing for Woodwind. And he reminded me very wisely of the break in the clarinet.
Which we're going to talk about that too.
All right. Okay, so general considerations. This is just kind of general things that apply to every woodwind instrument, and we're going to first talk about breathing.
We have to breathe. And you may think that is such common sense, but you'd be very surprised how many people forget that we have to breathe when we play. We have to stop and breathe. And just to make that clear, circular breathing is not a cheat code for endless phrasing and stuff like that.
Do not assume that your woodwind player knows how to circular breathe.
And
Just
it's
do
not
assume.
always as easy to do on especially flute and other winds. So
And the other thing is that embouchure power and the amount of muscle memory you have is also very important. It's how long can your embouchure last before you need to take a quick break. So it's not just the breath, but also, can your players sustain that level of performance and that level of intonation?
now right here, what we have listed, and I want to give a really big disclaimer. This is an extremely rough estimation of how long your player can sort of hold and sustain a note. Everyone's going to be different, but this is if you have a phrase that's lasting this long, you might want to rethink your phrasing. You might want to rethink that passage.
Yeah. Do we have a question?
Does this confirm then that double reeds are better than single reeds?
So going to double reeds, you can see there's a little bit of a difference between the oboe and bassoon and the clarinet/flute. And so I think what a lot of people don't realize about double reeds is there is a lot of reed resistance. And so there not only is there like tiny little hole in the double reed that you have to put your air through, there's just a lot of like tension and a lot of resistance in the reed. So therefore players are very unlikely to run out of or to use their full air capacity for the phrases. Most phrases I would say we get to about 50%. And so what happens if you can imagine if you just exhale 50% and inhale 50%, so you're only using half of your lung capacity at all times, that gets very, very exhausting. So most oboe players, they're very used to kind of determining their own breath marks. And so what I will say about definitely double reeds is unless you want a musical pause of some sort, so similar to like when you give string players a breath mark, that doesn't actually mean they breathe because they're string players, but that's because they want like a pause. Unless you're going for that, your oboe and bassoon player will probably determine their own breath marks. For flute, however, it's a little more important.
Yeah, but double reeds also have the issue of dead air.
Yes, back pressure, dead air. I mean, if you can just imagine if you breathe in a huge breath and then you use 50% of your air, now you have all that bad air left over. And so oboe players actually have to exhale. So we have to plan on writing an exhale marking. So I breathe out and then breathe back in to get to the next phrase. So if depending on what oboe player you're working with, they'll probably kind of determine their breath marks.
Yeah, thankfully flutes do not really have that issue because of the amount of air that we have to basically use.
Yeah,
and
as a bassoonist especially, is that air depends on which range you are in. Because the bassoon spans an extremely large range, which we'll cover a little later, that different range parts of the range takes a different amount of air. And that does factor in the calculus of it. Same thing with oboe.
Exactly. And we'll go into that when we get to each instruments. Okay, next, general consideration, dovetailing.
Now let's say you do want to have a really, really long phrase for your instruments. One of the biggest techniques to achieve this, and while still allowing your players to breathe, is something called dovetailing. Now, there's two ways you can dovetail. You can bounce a repeated phrase between two or more players. So if you have a flute 1 and a flute 2, or a clarinet 2, and we're going to show an example, don't worry, of how that would work. The other way you do this is you have one instrument do a phrase, and then you have another instrument finish the other part of the phrase that's a little bit more idiomatic for this other instrument. Great example, you have a flute going into the absolute freaking stratosphere, and instead of keeping that on flute, you chop it up and have the piccolo finish that phrase, which is another example we're about to show. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see this is something I've seen a lot. This is just a flute 1 and flute 2 doubling to add some volume, right? This is with no dovetailing. This is really tiring. Now, even if this is really fast, this is going to be terrible finger fatigue and everything. But now when we dovetail, notice that we still maintain the length of the phrase, the consistency of the phrase, and we even have the flutes alternating an accent between the phrases. Right? And we have time to breathe. So this is one way where you can do handoff dovetailing. So if we go to the next slide, this is something...
That's a screenshot of an actual...
an actual flute part that was put in a professional band arrangement. And one thing I'm going to talk about a little bit later is notes that go crazy high like that have ridiculous fingerings. And in the original recording for this, the flutes... From what I heard, they actually left out the last 3 notes before that last note on top in order to facilitate that. Now, what the composer should have done is, we can go to the next slide, is they should have done this, where you have the flute do the first part of the phrase, and you have the piccolo finish it. Now, piccolo is actually a transposing instrument. So what you have right there is actually, on piccolo, is actually sounding an octave higher, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, which is why it is actually finishing that phrase from before. Okay, so before we talk about, hit it again. Yeah, there we go. So another thing I wanted to mention really quickly for like a general technique among woodwinds. For whatever reason, there is a difference in the term tremolo for woodwind instruments. So now, as we know, with tremolos in string instruments, it's a trembling of the strings to sort of get that effect, right? On woodwinds, it's sort of been historically that a tremolo is a rapidly alternating set of notes that are generally a third or larger that we typically write. Now, what if you want that trembling? The answer to that is flutter tonguing. Flutter tonguing actually achieves that trembling sound. Pretty much all woodwind instruments can do flutter tonguing to an extent. Flutes, it's most easiest with. So
I would say it's pretty common in other styles like jazz. I've heard it in jazz. I've heard it in a lot of different styles. So.
All right, so now we're going to be discussing tuning tendencies. So why is it important to know tuning tendencies of your instruments, even when you're writing for professional players? The thing is, not everyone is going to play. Even the best pros are never going to play like this on the tuner, where they are absolutely perfect the entirety of the time. Instruments have tendencies to where they lean to. Now, flute, for example, plays pretty flat in its lowest octave, and as you can see, very sharp in its highest octave. What I have typically seen is you'll have band parts that will have 3 flutes, all doubled on each of their respective octaves. So you'll have flute 3 playing in the bottom register and flute 3 playing in the absolute top register. Now, let's say you have professionals doing that, and flute 1 is playing 3 to 5 cents sharp, not bad for that register. And then flute 3 is playing 2 to 5 cents flat, not too bad. But now you have an almost 10-cent discrepancy in the intonation, right? And that's going to show even in that context. So it's really important to keep this in mind. And you can see here, we have also labeled specific notes that are also very unstable on the instrument. So C sharp on the flute first, and well, it's technically second and third octave C sharp are pretty unstable on the flute. And then the highest octaves are even more unstable. Brooke will talk about oboe.
It's pretty similar in oboe. The joke is that oboe is like the most out of tune instrument. What I will say in general about tuning is if you're in a live setting, it's really going to depend on the experience of your players. Each instrument has its own way of tuning. There is no tuning slide on double reed, so you have to 100% use your embouchure. There are some ways to adjust your embouchure on flute and clarinet, but they also have a tuning slide. So I think it's just dependent on the experience of your players if you're in a live setting. In a digital setting, if you are an audio engineer and you are editing stems, plan on applying some sort of pitch correction. There is no shame in melodyning your instruments because you have raw stems. Those players, they're not reliant on adjusting constantly to the musicians around them. So plan on doing some sort of pitch correction if you are editing stems, especially if you're in those extreme ranges. I know flute, piccolo, if you're in those high ranges, it's going to be extremely hard to be perfectly on tune every single time. So yeah, I think it's really dependent.
Yeah.
Especially with double reeds. Double reeds are the entire mouthpiece is the reed. So it depending on whether your reed is naturally sharp or naturally flat, that will affect the tuning tendencies of the instrument depending on which reed you pick that day or what the temperature is outside.
So and also when you are writing, as I gave with my example of having flutes in 2 octaves apart, that's generally the worst thing you can do is having instruments double 2 octaves apart. Because if you're doubling 2 octaves apart, more than likely both of those instruments are going to be in opposing tuning tendencies. So that's just sort of a general rule of thumb.
Okay, so next we're actually going to look at each family of instruments and go into depth on each one, starting with flute.
All right. So one of the great things about the flute is that in order to create the air, you're essentially blowing across a tone hole that's creating vibrations within the tube. Now, because of that, you adjust the registers, the octaves, essentially with your airstream. Now, one of the ways this makes the flute a very versatile instrument is that we essentially use our air to cross the first and the second register of the instrument. And what's really cool about that, like I said, is it makes arpeggios and flourishes and things like that really flexible. Now, in terms of its range, not all flutes can hit that low B below the staff. We have to have a special key for that. Generally, the range is going to be from that B3. I put B flat 7 because yes, the flute can go higher than that, but generally, if you're going to go way higher than that, you want to be careful because the dynamics are not going to be relative or equal. So with that being said, you really want to imagine the flute's dynamics side of kind of like a giant crescendo. The lowest octave of the flute, it's really easy to play super softly and darkly and stuff like that, but it's almost impossible to really project beyond other instruments playing at, say, forte or fortissimo. The middle of the register, we can kind of get kind of loud, and then in the highest octave, we have the opposite issue, in which we're actually going to project beyond the dynamics that are listed. So, for example, if you have a C7 on a flute playing, and you ask the player to play at pianissimo, and you have a violin playing in any of its registers in pianissimo, that flute is absolutely going to steamroll that violin straight into oblivion. Yes, professionals can play somewhat softly up there, but the dynamics are still not going to be as equal to other instruments that have much more dynamic control. So that's something really big to keep in mind. The flute also, among other woodwinds, has a really wide range of tone color. I do find that this tone color is super flexible in its lower register. You can really go from a very warm sound to a dark sound, so it's actually hauntingly soloistic down there. But in the upper register, you can get a whole range of sounds too. Now, the highest note possible on the flute is an F sharp 7. Please don't ever write that unless you're writing Latin jazz.
And we will quote Greg on it.
Latin jazz flute players, they go up there all the time because of all of the blaring instruments that typically play in that style of music, and it's always so cool to hear.
Okay.
So we'll go on here. All right. So here's a general writing for flute, right? So we talked about flutter tonguing. Flute sounds really cool when you do flutter tonguing. Beatboxing is another thing that flutists can do, mainly because we don't have anything going into our mouths. So we kind of have like free reign in that regard. And then, multiphonics and harmonics. Now, Here, now we have three examples of the three main ranges of the flute. So here's the lowest register of the flute. Right, so really dark, really lush, but again, not very projecting. Okay, now this is the middle register. All right, and now we have the highest register, and you'll hear that piercing projection on this. Now, if you wanted to cut through your full orchestra, right, like you can hear how that's just going to kind of project and pierce right through. All right. Now, there's a couple of danger zones when writing for the flute. We're already so the way that we have to facilitate the lowest notes. I don't know if you can see it in that picture right there, but there is essentially these roller keys that we have to roll our pinky up and down from. And really interestingly enough, that unfortunately makes some of these trills completely physically impossible. Now I have listed all of the trills that you cannot do on the flute, and it's because of that switch of rolling between those keys. And it's kind of sad because those trills sound really beautiful, and I have actually encountered them and seen them here and there. So now, what if you want those trills? Alto flute, which I'm going to get to in a second. And then as we can see right here, B6 to D7. I usually say anything from B flat upwards to D7. That is the range where you really want to consider writing for piccolo, because like I said, piccolo is a transposing instrument, so those same pitches are going to be much more controlled, much less projecting, and the player is going to have far more dynamic and colored control over those notes. Okay. All right, so picking on the piccolo. All right. So one really quick thing to mention about the piccolo. Piccolo only goes down to a low D below the staff. The piccolo lacks a foot joint. So that's really important to keep in mind. And the piccolo is also a transposing instrument, which you can see right here. We have the piccolo written in its written pitch, and then the bottom here we have that's its concert pitch, right? Now the other thing about this is really important. You don't want to copy and paste your piccolo parts when you are actually writing and arranging, because you're going to get confused very quickly when you're going into finale and hitting that concert pitch button and wondering what pitches are where. Okay. Also, one thing I always recommend, write for the piccolo in its lowest register. I know it doesn't project as well, but it's got a really beautiful tone in its lowest register. It's got this woody tone that it's just lovely. All right. So let's, okay. And right here, we're just going to give some examples of the woody tone in its lowest register. Isn't that just precious?
Very underused.
Very underused. All right, and this is the register we probably all know and typically hear the piccolo in. Fiddle play. Right? And I did not make a recording up there because I didn't want to make you all go deaf. Which literally, that register of the piccolo does actually cause hearing loss. So it's literally a danger zone if you do not have hearing protection. So, all right. And next, we have the alto flute. Now, I love the alto flute. It has such a unique tone, especially in its lower register, which we'll play right here. It's very lush. Now, one thing I want to mention about the lowest register, the alto flute is a transposing instrument. So remember those physically impossible low register trills I mentioned in C flute? The concert pitch of those notes are fully possible on the alto flute because they are just right within the first register. So if you want to have those trills, put it on alto flute. It's going to sound beautiful. Now this is for the middle register of the alto flute. You see, it just has this really nice velvety color. Now, you don't want to write very much in the upper register of the alto flute. Remember when I said the flute plays really sharp in the upper register? The alto flute is even worse. There are certain notes where we have to flatten it and use different fingerings because it can often go an entire half step sharp. So you can, but it has an interesting sound, but you only want to use it if you know what you're doing. So I can play this right here. It's not pretty.
It's pretty. Because you make it sound so good.
How it's kind of pitched up there, especially if you hit the most extreme register, right? Right. Okay, and similar, those when you're writing for the alto flute in its written pitch, those are the notes that again are going to be physically impossible because it has the same roller keys. Okay. Now, one really quick thing, too, I want to mention. With the alto flute, with that third octave, really consider the standard range of the alto flute to be that E, that written E above the staff, because once you go above that, it's going to start to become really hard to control. So, all right. And here are just some examples of how not to write for flute.
Are these screenshots of things that you have played before?
Yes. So the one on the bottom, the worst... Yeah, I bet you do. The one on the bottom left is actually from the flute book of Beauty and the Beast, the musical. Now, here's why that one is so terrible, is because that book was flute and piccolo. And you literally switch from flute like 4 measures before you get that.
Why?
Why? So, yeah.
They had a bone to pick with someone.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah. And keep in mind, too, as you're listening, you're probably like, oh my goodness, we still have 4 more instruments. All of this is on the summer handout, so don't feel like overwhelmed, and it's a lot to remember.
All right. I'm gonna move.
Very good.
All right, super brief about saxophone, because you could give a whole panel on saxophone, I know. But generally speaking, when you're writing for saxophone in an orchestra, you want to avoid the altissimo. Because the altissimo sounds awesome, but in an orchestral context, you generally want to avoid that register, and the lowest notes of the saxophone are a bit hard to control in terms of articulation and volume, and they're very splatty, is what I will say. But the saxophone does have a really good dynamic range, very flexible dynamic range, which is also really nice for orchestral writing. So again, super brief on saxophone.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the oboe now. These are all the members of the oboe family, and if you go the next couple slides, we're going to be talking about those two right there, oboe and cor anglais, otherwise known as English horn. Those terms are used interchangeably. And if you look at this slide here, I just want to talk about the likelihood that you are able to ask your players for these instruments. The likelihood is very, very low. So first of all, heckelphone is like a collector's item, so that's just out of the question. Bass oboe and oboe d'amore, what happens with these instruments is typically if symphonies have a need for it, they will actually rent one for their players. So the common example that comes to mind is The Planets has a very prominent bass oboe part. And so typically the symphonies will just rent a bass oboe for the player, and the player is unlikely to have one. So I say this all to just put it out there that it's very unlikely that your player will have these instruments. So just use VSTs if you would really like these. But it is pretty safe to assume that if you have a professional oboist that they do double on English horn, but it's also good to ask just in case if you would like English horn. So we have some just fundamentals here. Our range is from low B flat to F6, high F. Not a terribly large range. Definitely one of the smallest ranges out of the woodwinds. However, I will note that if you are writing for wind band or if you're writing for young musicians, like let's say a high school wind ensemble piece, the lowest note is a B natural. That's a safe option because that B flat key is not on all intermediate and professional oboe models. Or it's on professional oboe models, but not on all intermediate models and not on any of the beginner models. So I would say if you are writing for grade school musicians, go ahead and stay between the B3 and D6 range. It's a little bit different than flute in terms of the dynamics because the dynamic range, well, it is smaller in general, but it's harder to play quiet at both extremes. So it's like is it a reverse bell curve? Am I saying that correctly? Like a reverse bell curve there. And then there's also less capabilities in those extreme ranges. So precise articulation, you can definitely achieve that more in the middle registers. You can have a lot more things you are able to do, but those extreme ranges are a little bit more difficult.
Question in the back.
Yes, question.
Is that expressiveness or like tone color?
All of that tone, color, articulation, technical passages. I'll go into that a little bit more, but yeah, capabilities and pretty much everything. So if you do want something complex, kind of like, I don't know, legato tongue combined with a technically difficult passage, it's really not realistic to do that at those extreme ranges. And I'll show kind of examples of how not to write for oboe, just examples of phrases that aren't as realistic. Okay, so very popular for melody lines and solos. Why is this? Why is there so many oboe solos? And first of all, I would say it's because of the timbre of the instrument. So the tone is very unique and it has this very piercing quality. It cuts through the ensemble, not because it's a loud instrument necessarily, but it's just kind of the nature of the tone. And so what I was saying before about needing less air and lots of air resistance, this actually does come in handy because players can play very long phrases without having to take a breath. So I'm going to play this recording so you can kind of hear. So you can hear that in the tone and then also just with the breathing. That was, just to put this into perspective, that's about 50% of my air. So that's like really doesn't need a whole lot of air to achieve that. And you can kind of imagine that being sung over the ensemble just based on kind of the timbre of it. It just has that very like piercing quality to it. I could talk a lot more about mixing for oboe because of how piercing it is and how your fader's like way down and it's just like cuts through it. It sounds like goose coming through your mix and it's like that. But you can kind of get it just by listening to the timbre there.
And also, that's a great point to also talk about how to pair your oboe, right? What instruments with which you're doubling the oboe, because there are pairings of oboe where oboe will absolutely override it, not because of volume, but because of that timbre.
Yes, exactly. Perfect. Thank you so much. Extreme air efficiency. Awesome. So on this next one here, similar to what Gregory did with the kind of the timbre of the different ranges, we're going to look at these different registers and talk about using oboe for its most effective purpose or whatever purpose you would like to achieve. So, let's see, we have the first register. By the way, these are all made up register zones here. We just like created a descriptive word for it. This is not an actual thing. So don't go to a musician and say, oh, I really like your shiny zone. They're not going to know what that means. So we completely made these up. So these are not like official words in any way.
Except for the clarinet. Yeah.
Okay, so here is the first register, or the first. So I'll give you kind of the most duck-like sound, but it is pretty distinct. It will really project through a full section. And next we have what I call the golden zone. Very song-like quality. It's probably the most commonly used for solos. And then we have next one. And then I played a staccato section here just so you can hear how harsh that tonguing is, especially at those higher registers. If you kind of want that harsh staccato heaviness, then really utilize that higher register there. And then we've got the very, very high there. So the most common comment I get is, that sounds just like a clarinet. So it really kind of loses its distinction when you get up there. Doesn't quite have that song-like quality. So especially when you get kind of above that E flat, it's very difficult for young musicians to play above that. So maybe consider putting it on the clarinet, because clarinet, they're used to a lot of high register stuff. Maybe if you want something like that, like a run, consider giving it to a different instrument, especially considering or depending on the experience of your players.
And it's the classic case of just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yes, thank you.
So I'll talk a little bit about it later, but definitely consider the purpose of which you're putting that part with that instrument. It's not just keeping that person busy.
Yes. Okay, and then so here are some oboe no-nos, and I did write most of these, so no, these are not in my parts. I just kind of created like what I thought would be like the worst possible. So I wanted to just include, we didn't talk about double tonguing. That's another thing similar to circular breathing. Do not assume that your woodwind players know how to double tongue. That's just not really a common skill. I would say it's easier on double reeds to double tongue than flute and clarinet, I would say, but it's still not a very common skill. So I would say woodwind players are used to single tonguing pretty quickly, but if your tempo is 160 and you're trying to have them play staccato 16ths, probably not going to happen. So that's number one there. We've got a typical one here at number 3. If you are having instruments, so this is of course in a live setting, switching to English horn, make sure you give them ample time to pick up their English horn. They're probably going to have to wet their reeds and make sure everything's good to go. We see this a lot in pit orchestra music. I'm sure flute to piccolo is the same way, just not enough time to switch. We do see that a little bit. I won't talk too much about number 2 because all of your trill fingerings, they're on the cheat sheet, so you can take a look at that. But we do have some trill fingerings over the break. The break between, for oboe, I don't think this is for clarinet, is between C and C sharp. So we do have some trill fingerings, but these are the ones that are the kind of impossible ones. Of course, I talked a little bit about staccato at the extreme registers. So if you are wanting to have a piano staccato at the low register, it's going to be very, very difficult. Similarly to technical passages in the high register at number 5. So those are some examples of what to avoid.
Yeah, I see number 5 a lot. And so don't copy and paste your flute parts into the oboe, is what I'll say about that.
Okay, and then here's a little bit about English horn, similar to oboe, but just a little bit of differences there. Yes, question?
You mentioned that there were certain instrument areas of oboe that were kind of particularly important. Was that for later in your mention, or instruments particularly?
We'll talk about that because we have a little arrangement at the end, and we can talk about kind of which ones sound good and which ones we like recommend. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. And if we still don't answer your question, you can ask us later. Okay, English horn. So fundamentals here. The big difference is it does not go down to B flat. There is a low B flat extension for English horn, but that is very uncommon, even on professional model English horns. So stick with that low B. And it is a transposing instrument. So the only other instrument that is in the key of F is French horn. So that's kind of cool that English horn is also in the key of F. That is why it's very typical for English horn to double French horn parts. So essentially when the orchestra tunes in A, English horn would play in E. So English horn sits at a perfect 4th down. I would say more so than oboe, dynamics and articulation stay pretty consistent throughout. I would say I wouldn't say it's easier than the oboe, but in terms of kind of the technical, being able to play technical, it is a little bit easier. It could be because the size of the reed is a lot larger. It allows for more air to go through, and it just doesn't require as much tight control and resistance. And again, that probably is due to the size, but it is a little bit easier to be more free with, at those extreme ranges there. And then here are some of the registers. I forgot to record that last one. That was what I was going to do before my flight left, and I still forgot. So we won't hear that gusty zone there, but here are those different registers there. First one, I called this the chocolate zone. We'll go ahead and listen. Lot more mellow and muffled than the oboe. Lot less penetrating, piercing. It is definitely a lot more mellow. The next one here, did I call that the goose zone? So there are 3 measly notes on the English horn that are just terrible, and that's B, C, and C sharp. They're so hard to get in tune. They're so hard to get to sound not like a duck. And so those can be really difficult. Unfortunately, that's in like the prime range. So if you have, grade level musicians doubling on English horn, I mean, you'll hear it in these 3 notes. So hopefully you can't tell by this recording that those notes are there. I don't know. Do you guys hear that? It's kind of more of the unstableness in those 3 notes there.
You can also hear that that's a very open. You can also hear that that's an extremely open sound, and also think about what does this range evoke, or what does this timbre evoke in terms of feeling. It's very exotic, very large range, in part because if you've ever looked into history of the oboe itself, the Armenian duduk, which actually evolved separately from the oboe family, can actually be compared most closely to the English horn. That's the one where every stereotypically Arabian piece, or like Middle Eastern piece that's supposed to be like some kind of Arabian night, desert night, that kind of open, exotic feel, that sounds exactly like English horn in this range. So it's very often compared to English horn. So for a lot of us, arrangers using Western instruments, this is a great way of kind of replicating that sound and that, feeling.
Thank you so much. I love that you added that. Exactly. The next range here is similar to the low piccolo. This is super underused with English horn. I feel like a lot of composers think, I just want a lower sounding oboe, so I'll just write for English horn, like low English horn. But I feel like a lot of composers forget that this has a completely different, distinct sound than an oboe. This range here, around, C sharp to A, very underused. It has a very, in my opinion, very like different sound. So I'll go ahead and listen.
I missed.
Also, a really good substitution is soprano sax. You can probably hear similarities between that and soprano sax. But again, I very rarely see solos in this range, and I think it's a really, really awesome range to write for.
Now, another thing Brooke and I typically see is people not having access to an English horn, and then they write an oboe solo in the bottom register of the oboe. Do not do that, because...
Yes, and you'll see on the next slide, I have the differences between them. And then really quick, I'll just talk a little bit about the high English horn, just some of its limitations if you go back to the last slide, and that gusty zone there. The English horn gets a little bit of a buzzy sound when you get too high. And so it's just really not meant for extreme ranges. I very, very rarely see parts that are above a high D. In fact, most English horns and even professional models don't have what we call a 3rd octave key in order to get to those high notes or to get to it easily. So I would say your safe bet is to keep it below that D there, or below would that be, a D6? Sounding D6, yeah. So just wanted to shout that out a little bit. And then I included this table just to kind of show you guys that an oboe and an English horn are very, very different. An English horn is not just simply a low version of an oboe. So I have the same solo that I have played, one on English horn and one on oboe, so you can kind of hear completely different color, completely different style. So we'll go ahead and hear the English horn one. Sorry. Alex is great. He's like our tech person right now, so. Okay, go ahead. It's all right. That was Skyview Temple from Skyward Sword, just in case you were wondering. So I would say English horn doesn't have that like uncomfortable piercing feeling like the oboe does, just completely different style, but it was all in the same pitch. So very different instruments depending on what you want to use for different things. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly touch on that. Clarinet!
All right, so now we're going to talk about the clarinet. Now, a fun little fact about the clarinet's registers, which do actually have official names, unlike other woodwinds, the clarinet registers are not separated in octaves. They're actually separated in twelfths. Crazy, right? Now, you can see here that we have sort of the separation between where the registers are. Now, the break between the first register of the clarinet and the second register of the clarinet happens in a really weird place in the staff. And I remember when I was studying clarinet in school, our teacher in a master class, we couldn't use the B word, which was the break. And the reason why we were not allowed to talk about that was because that was a part of the clarinet that we really had to practice, and we didn't want to say as this thing that is really hard, which it is, but to make it, to not create like fear around it, right? But essentially, when the clarinet crosses the break, we have to shift almost all of our fingers to achieve that. Now I'm going to talk about that in a second, but one of the other great aspects of the clarinet, other than its insanely wide range, which covers nearly four octaves, the clarinet has one of the most flexible dynamic ranges out of all of the woodwind instruments. It can go from actual true niente to fortissimo in pretty much its entire range, which is really quite amazing. The only time is when you get into the altissimo, just like the flute, it can kind of project a little bit more than you have that's written. But other than that, it's super duper flexible and amazing. Now, one of the things that you'll hear people say is like, oh, if you're writing for professionals, you don't really need to worry about the break. And I don't agree with that. And I'm going to tell you why. As composers and arrangers, you still need to be mindful of the break. The first big reason, other than to not really, in the back of those players' minds, piss your players off, is there is a very drastic difference between the notes below the break and the notes above the break. And so when you are writing and you have big, huge crosses between that, not only are you not going to get great legato because of the massive amount of fingers that have to shift between that, but you're also going to get very inconsistent tone colors. Now, professional clarinetists have fingerings and ways that we can mitigate that difference, but we're still fighting against the physics of the instrument. So, if we move on to this here, I'll show you some of the examples of what the different ranges sound like. So the first one is the chalumeau, which is really dark and projecting and full. Yeah, it's got that really pompous, full sound, which you don't really hear in, say, a flute. Right? So now let's move on to sort of the clarion register, which is we're above the break. Now so we'll hear that. So it's got that really nice rounded sound. Now we have the altissimo, which you can hear just has that right, so it just has that really big ping that you hear. Now the clarinet's really good at glissandos, which is where If you've ever heard Rhapsody in Blue, where the clarinet just sort of effortlessly slides up. So the reason for that is the clarinet actually has a lot of open tone holes as opposed to just keys that close down on it. So you can actually like move your fingers and adjust your embouchure to get that smooth slide. So that's why the clarinet's really good at scoops and bends and things like that. You don't typically hear clarinets used vibrato in more of a classical orchestral sense. You typically hear them use it in jazz. So when you're writing for the clarinet and you want vibrato, it might be a good idea to specify that in your arrangements. Okay. So just to kind of briefly talk about the bass clarinet. So the bass clarinet so first thing about the bass clarinet, never put it in bass clef. I've seen this a couple of times. Please don't do that. There's no reason to do that. I promise you, we bass clarinet players can read all of those ledger lines on all the way down the staff. It's pretty much a lot of what we do anyway, so we're super used to it. And with that being said, also don't put an 8 VB. That actually makes it harder for us to read it because we have actually associated those crazy ledger lines with the fingerings over the years. So, also with bass clarinets, if you're not writing for professionals, only really professional bass clarinets can actually hit that low C. There's not too many on the market right now that have that low C available that are not 5 figures in terms of cost. So unless you're writing for a professional, don't assume that they're able to hit that low C. So last time we gave this panel at VGMCon, we got a lot of arrangers and composers asking, what the heck do you do with the E-flat clarinet? And I'm going to answer that. So the E-flat clarinet, it's tuned to perfect fourth higher than the B-flat clarinet, so you can't really think of it as a piccolo in the same sense, but it is still a higher, more projecting clarinet. Now, the ways that you would want to use the E-flat clarinet, so we can move on here. This is Mog's theme from Final Fantasy VI. So you can see if on the top we have that on the clarinet. It goes kind of high. It still sounds pretty cool, but it's going to project quite a bit. And you can see that we're crossing into the altissimo range. Now, if we put that same phrase on the E-flat clarinet on the bottom here, you notice that's almost completely contained within the clarion register, just going into the very low amount of the altissimo. So it's going to sound a lot more tonally consistent and things like that. Now, there's also another use for the E-flat clarinet, and we can move on here. Now, when you're writing for the clarinet is kind of more of an alto voice within the woodwind family, which we're going to talk about. But a lot of people do write for it as more of a soprano voice. And I typically find that when the clarinet is written as a more soprano voice, because of where the break happens, I see a lot of parts that just randomly cross the break a lot when people are writing for it in more of a soprano, mezzo-soprano voice. Now you can write, go back one. Now you can write for the clarinet in a soprano voice, but it's better to write for the E-flat clarinet in a soprano voice because, well, I'll go back, I'm sorry. One thing you'll notice here, and if there's any clarinetists in here, you'll see that this is not as easy as it looks. This was the bass clarinet part in Symphony of the Goddesses, the Majora's Mask Suite. This is the Clocktown theme. This is really hard to play. And this is typically what you will see when you are writing for a clarinet in sort of a soprano range. Now watch what happens when we put this on the E-flat clarinet. Notice that we have cut the break crossing down quite a bit. Now, like I mentioned with the piccolo in its first octave also has the same issues as the flute, where it's not as projecting and doesn't have as much of a dynamic range. That's not true with the E-flat clarinet. The E-flat clarinet, just like the B-flat clarinet, has a really nice dynamic range, so you can actually get some volume out of it, which is why it would be nice to see more writing in the low register of the E-flat clarinet for situations like this. So this is in the same octave same register as what as what it was in the B flat clarinet. If we move it up the octave, which is kind of what it should be for that part. You can advance the slide here. You'll notice that now it's completely within the clarion register. We have no break crossing, and we have to add a sharp, but now we don't have to cross the break. So it's going to be a much more tonally consistent sound. So yeah, just to summarize, to use the E flat clarinet, if you're writing for the clarinet in a soprano voice and you're getting a lot of break crossing, because of what I showed you here, it's probably going to make it sound a lot better. Also, and I know we didn't really, I know Brooke mentioned this with oboe. When it comes to what you would expect players to own, I would say most flute players will own a piccolo. That's a very common thing to expect. If you're writing for a professional clarinet player, they probably have an E flat clarinet. It's not super common, but it is pretty common. But yeah, so that's that. So I hope that answered that question. Okay.
Woo!
So let's talk about the bassoon, the often forgotten one of the family. Everybody loves to give the bassoon whole notes and love to tie them to each other. And it's a great way for us to take our afternoon nap while everyone else is practicing. But I think the key thing about bassoon is that bassoon actually has an immense amount of range. It's an extremely versatile instrument, and you can do a lot with it. It's an extremely expressive instrument. I would actually draw a lot of parallels with saxophone and make the comparison from a clarinet to so clarinets have a closer range of like expression on certain ranges, I would say, and bassoon is similar to that compared to the saxophone. Saxophones can go all over the place. Bassoon's the more kind of like the restrained classical sound of that. Think about it that way. And then that speaks to the tonal flexibility. But then tonal flexibility also comes with a catch, right? If you're flexible with your tone, that means you're not always in tune. And Brooke mentioned it earlier with oboes and with bassoons, your tonality is really dependent on your player. Bassoons are mostly actually handmade, and the handmade ones, every single note is tuned in a different way on a different bassoon. So part of growing into that instrument as a player is learning that instrument's individual tendencies, and that sound projection of bassoon is not going to carry you that far. It doesn't have that sharp piercing timbre that an oboe would have. It's more there to support the rest of your instruments, but that does not mean that you can't use it to create interesting, feelings in a piece. And we'll talk to that a bit here. We're going to explain the range, we start with a very, very low B flat. It is actually possible to hit the A below it. You just need to sacrifice your local clarinet player. It's actually canon to take the bell of a clarinet, extend the bassoon with it, and that actually allows you to hit the low A. Just don't make that a trill. That would be very bad. And we can go extremely high. As we mentioned earlier, staff-wise, if you reach the higher ranges of the bassoon, please put it in tenor clef. That will make it easier to read, as long as you're not jumping back and forth between bass and tenor very quickly.
Does extending the bassoon with the extra clarinet part, does that not remove the actual lowest note of the bassoon? Does that not?
So that's where the tonal flexibility really comes in, is that yes, it does, but you can actually just make it extremely sharp. So a player is able to remedy that if they know about it ahead of time, but generally they would pretty much use it as a trumpet mute. They would just shove it in, play the note, take it off. There was one composer who alternated between that B flat and the A, and the players were not very happy. We'll put it at that. And the idea though is that bassoons can really fill two major roles, right? It's in woodwind quintets, or at least within small woodwind ensembles, bassoons can serve as that bass voice. It's there to really ground your chord in that sound and provide that carrying tone across your various melodical ideas. But in a large orchestra, it's generally not very effective to put them as that bass voice. Your trombones, your tubas are much more effective of holding a very loud, low note and grounding it. And having bassoon double that doesn't add all that much. And when I say think about why you want to use that instrument. It's not just about spending their time. If you add on a bassoon that doesn't really add anything on top of your tuba, are you really adding anything that you need? So if you're having a very brassy sound be your supporting sound, you can actually free up the bassoon to do a more tenor voice, maybe a counter harmony, or add interesting parts to it. So this is something to think about, is what role do you want that bassoon to be? It's a very flexible instrument. What do you want to achieve with it? And that's kind of what I outlined here, which is, what do you, in the end of the day, want your users, your audience to feel? And bassoon's a very versatile piece to achieve that, right? Do you want them to feel that it's a forlorn piece? Do you want them to feel that it's very playful? What are your agents of making that very playful? Is your piece in a very low range where putting flutes in a staccato in a low area a good idea? It's not. So then what if we put bassoon on it, right? So instead of having a bassoon play the long tones in that case, what if we had the bassoon play the moving pieces? And the first one there is actually a video of something called the dolchin. This is what bassoons originally were. It was an extremely tonally unstable instrument, and that's kind of where bassoon inherited a lot of that tonal flexibility nowadays. But think you see that it's extremely open. There's that characteristic duck sound, and it pairs very well with English horn. And that has a certain feeling that you won't get from most instruments. And use that to your advantage. While it doesn't mesh with all the instruments, make that difference work in your favor. And this is what Hindemith in this case does. We had a question earlier about pairings, right? There are pairings that are very unlikely that still work. In this case, Hindemith had a duet between bassoon and trumpet. And let's take a little look at how he actually achieves that and what value he gets out of adding a bassoon to this piece instead of making this a trumpet solo. You see that in this case, it's still grand. The bassoon is still able to create that very grand sound, but it also is able to create that a little bit of dissonance in timbre that puts you on edge. That feeling moves the piece. And then if we keep listening, we move into a slightly more playful tone and use bassoon to its advantage of being able to play. Yeah, it is very playful and is very interesting in the way that it was arranged. Obviously, this is a composer that has extensively played with the boundaries of what we can do, but it's a great way to reflect on why you want to have that bassoon there. It's not just about playing the note, and I think that's the key. Is that think about what you want them to actually do. It's not just what you want them to play, what you want them to do. So we're going to go on to the next slide.
And I hope this plays.
Okay.
All right.
Adjust the quality setting.
Yeah, because it's Google Slides is not great with embedding video. That's what I'm going to say. So I did a quick little arrangement of Lost Woods from A Link to the Past, which is actually a really good piece for showing pairings between melodic lines and having like staccato lines and sort of playful lines. So I arranged this in a way to where each time it repeats, a new instrument is going to be playing a different woodwind's going to be playing the melody, or is going to be playing the accompaniment part. So you'll really get to hear what an oboe and a clarinet are going to sound like doing the staccato. So let's hear it. So, hope
Some
that
MIDI in there. Yeah.
yeah, everything was live there except the bassoon. Yep.
There we go.
So
Okay. We just we put together just some things to kind of point out from the arrangement. Now we're talking a little bit more now about how to write and arrange like in a large ensemble setting, or in this case a small ensemble setting. So I don't know if any of you want to kind of point out some things that maybe you heard, or go ahead.
yeah, so really like one of the things I always talk about too when pairing, like we talked about what do you want to pair an oboe with? If you pair because an oboe is very projecting, say like in its middle register, I've always found that having the flute sort of in its upper register can help to match the dynamic level of it. And as you heard there, I think there was one part there where the flute and the oboe were pretty close in dynamics because of they were kind of in their own respective middle upper registers. So do we have a question or? Oh, never mind. Okay.
Yeah. So one technique I actually use is considering the attack and the sustain of every single instrument when pairing. Is that if you're playing extremely fast notes, you don't want to pair instruments that have very different attacks. So, for example, if you have a really loud brass playing a lot of staccato, they can generally hide the attack of other instruments. But if you have an extremely piano part and you have an oboe with very high back pressure doing staccato notes, that's going to stick out like a sore thumb. As opposed to, say, putting a flute purposefully in a lower register just so that it's more breathy of an attack.
Yeah.
And then when we say intonation, generally that refers to the sustain of the note, where effectively people will tilt back to the correct tuning, but it takes time. And you really have to consider how long does each instrument take to tilt back, and are you going to have an even tilt between the instruments that you've paired?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course it can be difficult to write for smaller ensembles because of course the less instruments, the more exposed. So I kind of wrote this. Every instrument is important and must be treated with care and consideration. So just kind of knowing that every instrument kind of has its own unique thing that you're doing with it. And then just general writing takeaways in a large ensemble setting. Lots of rests are very normal. You do not feel like your woodwinds have to fill up the entire page. That is very exhausting. Of course, all of this is dependent, again, on the experience of your players, but just keep that in mind, depending on their stamina level. You can do a lot of experimentation with doubling of instruments, and then just kind of reiterating what we said in small ensemble.
And on the flip side of not being afraid to give your instrumentalists a lot of rest. On the flip side of that, also don't be afraid to have doubling written in your parts. Having a flute player switch to piccolo. That's a very common double to have, especially if you're doing something where we were talking about dovetailing, where you're going to have another instrument finish a phrase that might not be as idiomatic in the instrument that started the phrase, right? And so like I was saying, piccolo is very common. For clarinet players, E-flat clarinet, at least someone in a professional orchestra should hopefully have an E-flat clarinet. So things like that, right?
Yeah, the two big ones too that we do see a lot in the context of, let's say, a woodwind quintet. The bassoon is the bass voice. Now it's not considered a bass instrument. It'd probably be more considered a tenor.
Yeah.
You would probably agree with that. But of course, in the context of a small ensemble, your low winds, your low woodwinds are going to be your bass voice. That doesn't mean you have to just have them have the bass part the whole time. They can have the melody too. You can kind of change the overall range of that as you see fit. So I put that there. Bassoons don't always need to be bass 24/7. Of course, I put no solo monopolization. So of course, experiment with different instruments, having different solos, not always flute all the time.
And as a matter of fact, bassoon in the high ranges is actually a very beautiful solo. So it.
Yep, and that's another thing too. If you do not have access to an English horn and you get the urge to write for the oboe in its bottom register, which again you should not do, if you put that on the bassoon, it actually puts it right in the middle of its range. The bottom register of the oboe kind of translates to the middle of the bassoon's range, and it sounds beautiful. Mm-hmm. So I would say the bassoon would be a good lack of English horn replacement.
Yes, better than a low oboe.
Much better than a low oboe.
Yeah.
So that is it.
Yeah, right.
I have, thank you guys so much. So, feel free to use us, and we'll have time for questions. Let's see, what time is it? Yeah, we have plenty of time. So, feel free to use us as a resource moving forward. The QR code on the right has all of our social media contacts. So, feel free to reach out to us if you need just kind of a quick check of how are my parts doing, or maybe you would like us to play for, your tracks, that's always good too. So we have that. And then the QR code on the left is just simply the electronic version of here. So when we're done, please feel free to take all of these. I printed 50 copies. So if we do run out, everyone will have the digital copy. This is just a summary of everything we said. So you have everything in writing just it's kind of like a reference sheet, it's front and back, just like a little 2-page reference sheet moving forward. And yeah, I don't know if any of you guys have any closing statements or.
No.
Yeah.
Guess, do we have any questions? Oh, okay.
That's okay, you can go first.
Okay.
I had a question about your last woods arrangement and your opinion of the last iteration. Why do you feel that, at least to my ears when I was noticing, the oboe on the last iteration actually, even though it's playing the bass part, sounds like it's actually the lead at that time?
Do
you feel like it's the range, or do you feel like it's something else?
It's the range. So the oboe in this lowest register tends to play very loudly. And that's the opposite of the flute. Because the flute is going to play, it's going to play much more softly in its lower register because of the dynamic difference. Yeah. It could also be my on-the-fly mixing.
For this range, it seems like it's cutting through the other ones that are.
And that's why. Yep.
And oboe always cuts, and I will say your live oboe is going to cut even more than any MIDI oboe out there. So I know MuseScore is a very popular notation software that many of you are familiar with. The oboe default MIDI on that is a lot more mellow than a real live oboe. Even if you have an oboe player with very dark reeds, they prefer that kind of dark sound. It's still going to sound more like a duck than the MIDI. Just putting that out there. Yes. For a variety of reasons, but that might be it. Yes. Yeah.
On that subject of the cutting, so if it is subjective, what are some pairings you do like to try to put alongside oboe or oboe won't overpower? Particular instruments, you'd be like, yeah, that's great.
So a very common was oboe and flute. And because oboe, like let's say we put oboe in a middle register, we put flute in a high register, because flute has the ability to play loud and it's kind of shrill, not shrill in a bad way.
It's going to project.
But projecting,
Yep.
you can get that match. Now, if you were going to do middle register oboe and a low register flute, that flute is just going to get overpowered.
Yep.
But oboe's really good pairing with anything because of it, again, not because of its volume, but because of its timbre. You can pair it with a trumpet, you can pair it with a brass, and it'll still, it really cuts through.
Especially with strings as well.
And strings.
Couple people over.
Strings is golden.
Yes.
What extension can online resources like pitch correction, change, and limitations these instruments have?
So resources for pitch correction. I use Logic as my digital audio workstation. That's so typically when you use pitch correction, you have to be in what's called a DAW, or a digital audio workstation. A popular one, a free one, is Audacity. Reaper's, I believe, free still. Is Reaper still free? Those Reaper users out there.
Technically.
It will continually yell.
Yes.
Okay, so technically free.
Yeah.
I know GarageBand is like a more user-friendly version of Logic. So so let's say you have a stem that you would like to pitch correct, you will have to put that into a DAW first, and then most DAWs have their own soft plugins for pitch correction that I would say that they're generally pretty good.
Yeah.
When we say Melodyne, that's the standard. That's a paid plugin software. Am I answering your question? Like what software to use for pitch correction?
Well, more so like how much can they change any specific tendencies instruments have?
Oh, that's a great question. That is totally going to depend on your pitch correction software. If you have something really good like Melodyne, your instruments can be 50, 60, 70 cents sharp and flat, and it will be great.
Yep.
And then the cheaper ones or the free ones like I use, you have to be within like, I would say 20 cents sharp or flat.
Yeah.
It does get kind of dicey if anyone here has ever used pitch correction with winds. So sometimes it weirdly depends on the range.
Yeah.
It depends on the tonguing.
I find that Melodyne loves clarinets, but it absolutely despises flutes. There's a number of, and I know why it hates flutes. It's really because of how the note attacks and the wide vibrato that flutes are capable of. I remember I listened to, and this is another kind of interesting orchestration choice. There was a piece in Octopath Traveler 2 that had an alto flute and a piccolo doubling. It had the alto flute in its bottom register, and it had a piccolo actually in its upper register. And immediately, it was a cool texture, but I could definitely tell it was pitch corrected, because it was definitely playing in opposing tuning tendencies. And one of the ways I can hear when flutes are pitch corrected is when the note attacks, it'll sort of go hya to actually attack the note, as opposed to what usually happens. It'll go a little bit of a very, very quick, like wah, kind of like it'll kind of wave up into the note. It's a very subtle thing.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a very subtle thing.
That attack and sustain.
Yes.
Yeah. I was gonna say something else too that just came into my head about pitch correction. And keep in mind too, pitch correction will not change your tone. So if you have very poor tone, it's not going to fix it. Yep. This is a whole nother like can of worms that I'm opening right now. But your microphone is not going to make you sound better. It's going to make you sound the same or worse. It is not going to make you sound better.
Correct.
So I would definitely say that if you, no matter what pitch correction you use, you still need to have at least the experience to play almost in tune, or else
Let's just go this way.
Okay, sorry.
We're going to go this way. So,
How would you recommend arranging chords for wind ensembles?
Chords.
Typically, like, what's the third, what's the first, what's the fifth kind of thing?
Yeah.
Is that your question? Just which instrument to put which?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say in a wind quintet setting or small ensemble, oboe is very typically the third of the chord. Clarinets, would you say those are the blue notes?
Yeah, and I think another thing too is just as a general rule, keep in mind what the dynamic flexibility of those notes are. So, like for example, you would probably never want to put the root of the chord in, say, the clarinet's throat tones, which are the few notes that are right before the break, because those notes are going to be really unsupported. A really great thing to do is when you're writing your woodwind parts and you're wondering how the support's going to happen, look at fingering charts and see how many fingers are down and how many fingers are up. The less fingers down, the more sort of unsupported the note's going to be, and the more fingers that are actually down, the more stable and supportive the note may be. That's sort of a general rule of thumb. There's some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's one way you could also follow that. But yeah, it's keeping in mind the sound that you want, the dynamic range of the notes that you want.
And also the melody.
And also the melody as well.
What note is in the melody line and which register is it in? Because you want to make sure that you have either enough or not or less distance between that and the root note, and that depends on which range. Whose range is the golden range?
Yeah.
You really want that root note in someone who has that note as in their golden range.
Yeah. I think in general, a good resource if like you're interested is looking at like famous woodwind quintet pieces or just like classical pieces and just kind of studying it. So like Barber, Nielsen, I'm just like throwing like pieces and looking to see what they do and how they write for them, which ones are the roots, how do they change character, how do they go to the different phrases. I think that's always a good resource, just to kind of like look at those like famous pieces that are famous for a reason.
Hope that answered it.
So I'm a songwriter producer, and I try to write 80s city pop music that has a lot of horn sections or like 70s singer-songwriters. When I do it, it doesn't sound right. So I guess my question is like, how would you approach like studying or critically listening to that kind of music to learn how to arrange it? Or if there's any like teachers or people that can apply or experts in it.
I'm not super well versed in that genre, but
me neither. Unfortunately,
if you typically use horns, are you talking about brass? You normally use brass for your songs.
Honestly, just doing the arrangement. I think a lot of times it's just arranging. Because the way I taught is self-taught. Is mostly just doing the arrangement, maybe going on MuseScore, seeing how they did, compare multiple arrangements, and just not taking one as the single source of truth. Understand why they put each part in each instrument. And again, that goal. Everything should be purposeful. If you have someone there that is not doing a specific role, you question, why am I having that instrument there? Does that instrument need to play? Because for the longest time when I first started, especially since organizing for community orchestras or for student orchestras, one of the top goals was to make sure everyone had their fair share of playing. And that is a trade-off. You have to understand that that's the trade-off of a properly good arrangement where you only use the instrument where it actually is useful. Good sound is better than no sound is better than bad sound.
Yes.
Yep.
I like that.
Thank you.
I have a question about the bass clarinet. Like in a small ensemble scenario, like if you had access to both a bassoon and a bass clarinet, kind of where they're both low instruments but that can also go very high, or if you had one or the other, like compare and contrast what.
Right.
Yeah, like color-wise, tone-wise.
So I would say that, well, there's a couple things. So firstly, I would say that the bass clarinet definitely has a far more abrasive tone than the bassoon. And that's not only just because that's sort of its sound, but also because, like all the other clarinets, the bass clarinet also has an extremely wide dynamic range. Again, niente all the way up to triple forte, especially in those really low meaty notes. Like those really are very pompous and loud. So it depends. It's definitely not a question of like, hey, bass clarinet's going to be better in all these ways here versus bassoon. It's definitely a use case scenario for that, because the bassoon does not have nearly the same dynamic range as a bass clarinet.
Yeah, and the bass clarinet tend to be a little more breathy, at least in my experience, where the sound is just more hard to stay open. It's a little raspy, right? And then
it's upper register,
and then also the bassoon is the intonation, right? How much tonal inflection do you need? Do you actively need to finger every single note, or can you just lip it a note up or down to get that effect? Because you're going to get a very different flow.
Yeah.
With the bassoon versus the bass clarinet. Yeah. Oh yeah. You're going.
I just have a quick one. Which game soundtrack do you actually think nailed woodwind arrangement and composition? Like, which one sticks out in your mind as being like?
There's a couple, for sure. I promise. Okay, maybe I am biased, but Chained Echoes. I mean, just the way that composer used flutes. I'm sorry. I just got to. It really was amazing what he did. Eddie Marianucro, oh God, I hope I said his name right. He's a genius orchestrator. I would also say
Mario Rabbids Kingdom Battle, Grant Kirkhope.
yes.
That's a good one that a lot of people probably would forget. The new Link's Awakening, correct? Yes. The new Link's Awakening for 3DS.
Oh my
so I guess
goodness.
not that new anymore, but
Yes.
those are the two that come to mind for me.
And I know there's ones that I should be Journey. I will tell you, when Austin Winnery had the flutes going up to their highest D7, which again you should very rarely do, he did it brilliantly. And he had the D7 playing when the character is sort of ascending that mountain and there's that sort of shimmering light that happens. That's sort of when that D7 happens. And it just, that sort of out of tuneness, the shrillness that you get out of a flute in that D7 happens right there. And it's just perfect. It's just perfect.
Yeah, for me, I've always been a diehard Xenoblade fan. So in the original one, Satoral Marsh, at night, fantastic blend of oboe and bassoon, uses each one extremely well with the orchestra and actually brings out the true timbre, despite staying within a lot of very stereotypical use of very slow long tones for bassoon, your standard oboe in their middle range, but it gets an effect that really hits home for me.
Yeah.
Do we need?
Are
Nope.
we good?
Yes, we are. So
Is there something going on right now?
no, actually 5 o'clock is the next thing, which is the Woodwind sight reading. So we can apply some of
There
these.
was a question, by the way.
Yes, there's a
I wanna
question.
skip over.
Yeah.
When you mentioned the E-flat clarinet versus B-flat clarinet, you talked about the break, accounting for concert pitch and not transposed, but is the break the exact same spot between B-flat and E-flat, or is it transposed?
So the B flat and the B natural, that's transposed. Yeah, that's transposed.
So in concert pitch, it would be A flat to A natural. In B flat clarinet.
On B flat, yes.
And then for E flat clarinet, it would be.
Oh God.
Your E-flat clarinet player will have the same break.
Yeah, it'll be transposed in the same way. Yes.
I don't know, the easiest way to say that.
So then, for something trying to integrate E-flat clarinet, it'd probably be something where a novice approach might be to see if your part is straddling the break.
Yes. You'll notice, based on my example, that like from when you saw in that example where it was just bouncing all over the break, you notice that because the bass clarinet is a fourth higher, it'll put it either above or mostly below the break, if you either keep it in the same register, you keep the pitches the same, the concert pitch is the same, either in the same register as the B flat clarinet or an octave higher. Either way, it's going to reduce break crossing and it's going to make it a lot more tonally consistent. And that's the other thing too, like I was mentioning, don't be afraid to write in the low register of the E flat clarinet, because the E flat clarinet is very dynamically flexible down there.
And then just one final comment.
Yep.
You say, when he was asking about choral arrangement,
Yes.
would you say that like more open voicings, sixths, and things like that, as opposed to more closed voicings?
Well, see, that's the thing. If you have a very open voicing so again, the throat tones of the clarinet, the notes right before that break are extremely open and very hollow sounding and somewhat unsupported. If you put those same notes in the E flat clarinet, they're going to be put right in the middle of either of those respective registers and are going to be more supported. So it's something to really experiment with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a quick comment and a question. The comment related to pitch correction. My experience is mostly production. Make sure you get as high a quality, like as high a sample recording as you can.
Yes.
You can get away with a lot more pitch correction.
That's very true. Yes.
We'll repeat that just so it's on the mic. So he was saying the higher the sample rate, the better, to make your pitch correction even better. And thank you for letting me know.
Yep.
I like hearing that.
My question is kind of related, but to like recording and miking, like, is there like any best practices or any pitfalls for recording Woodwind?
That's a whole panel.
That's a whole panel, but I'll give you the really TDLR version. Bassoon is not directional at all. Lots of room treatment. It's the sound's gonna go haywire.
Yeah.
Lots of key clicking on everything. So you're better off with the mic farther away with the gain up versus the other way around with gain lower with the mic close.
Yeah.
It does not mic at the bell. Do not put it at the bell. Put it over the tone holes.
It's not like brass. It is not like brass.
Those are the ones. Those are my TDLR tips.
And also the directionality, like with flutes, which side of the flute?
Yeah,
Not intuitive.
I have seen like Hollywood concerts where the sound engineers clip a clip mic onto the end of the flute, and you just wonder why it's not heard.
We still have that.
Sit there. Yes.
Yeah, we still have those.
I still show up and have the mic. Literally, they think it goes like inside the bell or something.
Who watched the Game Awards with Flute Guy? Yeah. So I was so mad because he was playing it was a contrabass flute. Fun fact, that was a contrabass flute, and the mic was like right on the bottom of it. You couldn't hear him, and you could barely hear him. And that's why they put it right there. And what was so bad is they did that the first time, so you'd think they'd learn, and you think, Pedro Eustache is Flute Guy, who's probably one of my top 5 favorite flute players of all time. But I can bet you he probably said something on the first time, and the sound engineers was like, no, that's not right. No, that you don't mic a flute there. So, yeah.
If you guys have any additional questions, feel free to chat with us afterwards. I really want to make sure that our next event gets set up.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much. You guys are a great audience. Thank you. Use us as a resource. Come and chat with us.
Yeah, we're all here.
We're all here. Come and talk. Please come up and grab your sheets. And thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.